I was talking to Patrick, the marvels of technology. They're supposed to make life easier. But the topic of the paper is talk on true happiness. When I was growing up, there was a popular song, "Happiness is Different Things for Different People," by Ray Conniff, 1966. At about the same time, there was a popular song, "True Love," looking back to that period of time, not long after the second of two world wars and the Great Depression. I could see a shift in sentiment, or something deeper than that, in the culture of the times. I do not want to attribute it wholly to the effect of the disasters of the early 20th century, inducing a disillusionment over the optimism that was generated by the seemingly long-term progressive march of science and technology, as evidence of the triumph of the human spirit in all respects, even religious. But there had been a loss of the sense of truth about things, as they may be noted in its absence in the song Happiness. It was still there in the song True Love by Cole Porter in 1956, but it would not be long before it disappeared also in that expression. Though the words love and happiness are rather to do with the good than the true, it is quite obvious that for them to have any objective meaning, they must be founded in truth. We know this in regard to all things, even non-spiritual, as in speaking of true gold and false gold. The latter we refer most significantly as fool's gold. Happiness that is not true happiness might just as well be that of a fool. The same with love. It is not a new failure to distinguish truth from falsity, and therefore true good from evil. I'm just noting its subtle emergence in recent times. It has obviously roots in earlier times. We are just noting here how it came to the surface, as it were, in the language of modern popular culture. This distinction has been known from the beginning of human intellectual life. Aristotle dealt with it in his critique of the efforts of the ancient sophists. What is expressed in the words of the popular song of the 1960s is but the re-emergence of the dictum of Protagoras: man is the measure of all things. Put in philosophical terms, it is pure subjectivism and moral relativism. We see it today in people saying my truth and your truth. So the song says, your idea of happiness is different from my idea of happiness. Yet it is quite obvious to anyone rational that true happiness is the same thing for different people. It is the ultimate good desired, the true end of everything that understands what good is. It does not take much philosophical reflection, let alone Catholic faith, to see that the supreme good is one being, God. Boethius provided the classic definition of happiness, that which excludes all evil and fulfills every desire. That is to say, for a human being of spiritual soul and intellectual powers, of knowledge and will, it is to possess what is goodness itself. That is the true God. St. Thomas notes a distinction between happiness as it means the object or thing possessed, and as it names our state of possessing and enjoying. There arise problems with understanding how to bring these two notions together, and both Aristotle and St. Thomas bring in as well a distinction between perfect and imperfect happiness. The distinction between natural and supernatural happiness is another complication. However, we are not concerned in this talk to enter into these connected questions, though they are worth careful study and soluble to a point along Aristotelian and Thomistic lines. We are here concerned with seeing that happiness has to be understood as true happiness and must be seen as objectively identified with the one true God. In this regard, there arises another question to which we mean to devote our main attention. St. Thomas insists that true happiness, objectively considered, consists in God alone. In recent times, this has been challenged even by highly regarded Catholic theologians, such as Germain Grisey. We mean to address the basis of this mistaken understanding of happiness, objectively taken, which, as we shall see, it needs to involve an entry into metaphysics and the distinctive supernature of God. The main point that I make is that the ideas, which word covers all products of acts of the mind, intellect, reason, not just concepts, but also propositions and argumentations, discussed here, such as happiness and love, are nearly always framed without making any distinction between true and false. For instance, take the expression that all religions lead to God. Without going into the distinction between religion, meaning a set of beliefs, and its more proper meaning of a virtue related to justice, obliging worship due to God, our Maker, we can agree with the expression provided it is understood as concerned with true religion or religions. In justice to God in a natural moral order, there are many false gods believed in whose worship is sinful and vicious. At the level of natural reason, the concrete mode of worship is not determined, but it is at the supernatural level. At both levels, we can say that all modes of true religious worship lead to God. At the supernatural, the Christian or Catholic level, it can be said that all religion or religions lead to God, but that there is only one God-given way in Christ, who exists in this world in his mystical body, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. All other religions, in inverted commas, plainly reject the one new order in Christ's sacrifice, which fulfills the one true church's claim. And in that regard, all other modes or orders of divine worship are anti the true religion. They obey the concrete religious worship determined by God in the Eucharist. Sadly, it seems that many today, even at the highest level of the Catholic hierarchy, are failing to teach this gospel to the faithful and to the whole world according to their divine mandate. Thus, the expression that all religions lead to God is not true if they do not involve the worship of the one true God, in the manner that God has revealed as the right way to do this, in the concrete sacramental way of the Catholic, that is, universal church. At the natural level of reason, that supposes we know with certainty that God, truly understood as far as we can, exists. St Thomas Aquinas provides such certain proofs, and St Paul provides scriptural confirmation. Yet how many Catholic scholars today follow St Paul and St Thomas Aquinas in this? That is the importance of the main point made in this talk. Though it is being made in reference to human happiness in the possession of God at the level of nature, it also applies analogically to the supernatural level of our grace nature. Grace perfects human nature. It does not sideline it. So too, the beatific vision or supernatural happiness perfects natural happiness and does not rub it out, as de Lubac and his followers imagine. To this main point, we can also relate a fundamental error of method in reasoning. It consists in thinking that human reasoning cannot arrive at truth, but at best only approaches it. This can be put as rejecting Aristotle's notion of demonstrative proof, which he named analytic, and which St. Thomas called demonstration, and making probable proof as understood by Aristotle, which he termed dialectic, the highest mode of rational proof. When Aristotle claimed he was in effect the inventor of logic, what he was referring to was analytic, certain intellectual knowledge through demonstrative proof. It is absolutely critical that we distinguish dialectic from analytic. In the practical order of ethics and politics, dialectic even tends to descend to a form of rhetoric. Plato did not reach this level of proof in his dialogues. They were discussions in which the mode of reasoning he indeed called dialectical. This was the original idea of Plato's philosophy that fell short of Aristotle's general notion of science. It left the deep questions of philosophy unresolved. Plato's method of dialectic did not achieve the aim of philosophy as stated by Aristotle and repeated by St. Thomas. The aim of philosophy is not to know what many may think, centenarians, but the truth of things, veritatem rerum. Aristotle showed that in the rational arts, dialectic is concerned with what many may think, but it is analytic, put in St. Thomas's respondendum est, that is the rational means or logic to arrive at the truth of things. What has happened in the modern era is the general rejection of Aristotle's philosophy and logical legacy, which has gone for too many Catholic philosophers and theologians disdain for Aquinas, even though he has come to be regarded as the principal philosophical and theological teacher called the Common Doctor. Read Pope Leo XIII's Aeterni Patris. That it is that truth as an aim of modern academic discussion, has dropped out of the picture, and we may even reverse the quote from St Thomas above. Put most charitably, we may say that the modern method of intellectual investigation has reverted to an exercise in dialectic a la Plato, which needs to be completed by the analytic of Aristotle. There is a place for dialectic, as is clear in Aquinas, but there is no place for an unending discussion of opinions. That is another way of putting the main point I make in this talk. However, I do not wish to go further in commenting upon these faults of reasoning so pervasive in our times, even among Catholic moralists and theologians. There is one other distinction that ought to be carefully noted before proceeding. That is the distinction between understanding of first judgments or principles, to which corresponds the habit of understanding, on the one hand, and the certain knowledge through demonstrative proof, to which corresponds the habit of science. Ignorance of Aristotle has led to the complete ignorance in modern times of this distinction. The result is that not only is there no truth held in regard to conclusions of science, but also this radical skepticism has spread to not even acknowledging, to the point of absurdity, of the truth of primary judgments of intellect that concern principles immediately known, upon which truth rests the certainty of all scientific knowledge. The modern mind does not only think that scientific conclusions are basically matters of opinion, but also holds that about first principles as well. So absurd is this intellectual lack of position that it is essentially incurable. Aristotle explains, whoever errs in principle errs incorrigibly. With that understood, let us proceed to address our subject more directly. That was by way of preface. Introduction. The first thing to do is to try and avoid unnecessary complications that make the discussion almost unmanageable. So large and complex can it become if we do not make this effort. The most significant of these is not to clearly distinguish supernatural happiness from natural happiness. The former requires the discussion to involve sacred theology, whilst we mean here to deal with questions as philosophical only, something that Aristotle would have needed to address. He did so, but left it not fully solved, which involves another complication. Let us examine the first complication. In fact, in the current discussion of the question of true happiness, such is the influence of the likes of de Lubac and Nouvelle Théologie in regard to submerging natural happiness in supernatural happiness, that this complication is virtually ineradicable. It amounts, in fact, to holding that grace dispenses with nature rather than perfects it. We must insist on the distinction, and hopefully as we proceed, it will become clearer why it is necessary to focus on natural happiness. Not to deal with it first, indeed, inhibits the proper understanding of supernatural happiness, especially called the beatific vision. This brings us to a second complication, which is within the discussion of the matter from the viewpoint of reason, if this may be helped by the light of faith. To get an idea of how we need to view true happiness as a natural end of human life, it may help to consider the theological position of the existence of limbo for those who die without baptism, not having any stain of sin except original sin, such as the unborn aborted. That is regarded by theologians as a state of natural happiness, with the loss of supernatural happiness. Aristotle faced the problem of not being able to attain natural happiness in this life, because one of its conditions is that it be permanent and unlosable. So there was a distinction made between perfect and imperfect happiness, the latter only being attainable in this life. The Greeks had an expression called "no one happy until dead." Perfect natural happiness, therefore, had to be somehow endowed with God after death. Of course, there was no way of knowing how this could be, and its possibility is only conceivable by the theological means indicated. We make no judgment here on the conclusiveness of this position. By the way, death is natural and only unnatural on the loss of grace, which is in fact the human condition after original sin. Look at the animal world that has no original sin as such. What we need to be careful of, though, is not to confuse the use of the distinction between imperfect and perfect happiness in this natural context with the use by St Thomas of the same distinction in comparing natural happiness with supernatural happiness. Even St Thomas does not always speak clearly here. The comparison can be used even when we are contrasting supernatural happiness with perfect happiness naturally considered. It is not that there cannot be perfect happiness naturally considered. They are just two infinitely different orders of the end of human life, one of nature, the other of grace. As explained at the start, we wish not to complicate our discussion by involving the order of grace. This we wish to exclude, even though in fact human nature, Adam and Eve, was created with grace, so that natural happiness is not the end actually or factually planned by God for human beings. By a free gift, the higher end of beatific vision surpasses the order of natural creation without annihilating it in any respect. The question can still be discussed whether human nature as such has a natural finality that can be called natural happiness. De Lubac and his followers, who are many and most influential, contend that somehow, despite us not ceasing to have human nature with human form, naturally spiritual, have ceased to have a natural end or final cause. They do not see that this means that grace dispenses with nature, contrary to the truth that it perfects nature. De Lubac thinks he finds support for his position in St Thomas in saying there is a natural desire for the beatific vision. St Thomas does say something like this, but the context has to be carefully discerned. It would be equivalent to saying that we can prove from the quasi-infinite character of the object of the human intellect or reason that we can know the Trinity without revelation. However, we will not go into this argument here, as we have done so elsewhere. When we speak of true happiness here, we are therefore referring to true natural happiness. The fact that humans have been ordained by God to something infinitely more blessed does not mean that the natural order of creation has not a natural end. That the natural order of creation that has a natural end is rubbed out to make room for grace. Nor should we think that there was ever any natural capacity within human rational power to know the supernatural order of grace or to desire what is obtainable through it. In this talk, therefore, we propose to discuss the meaning of true happiness purely philosophically. There is, however, one issue concerning it that has arisen within Catholic circles in recent times. That is the issue referred to in our initial remarks on the scope of this talk. It is whether God can be thought to be exclusively all that our true happiness consists in. Such as Germain Grisey seem to deny this, even in regard to supernatural happiness. Indeed, though we consider the issue purely philosophically, our answer may be seen to apply also where supernatural happiness or the beatific vision is concerned. We will deal with this issue after treating the question of what true happiness consists in. It may be appreciated as we proceed that much of what applies to true natural happiness may be applied analogically to true supernatural happiness. Let us proceed dividing this talk into two parts or chapters. Chapter 1, In dealing with what is true happiness philosophically taken, we need to begin with Aristotle's classic work on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics. He begins this classic work with what seems to be what needs to be considered first of all, whether there is a natural end of human life and what it consists in. The Catholic has the advantage of a complete commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics by St Thomas Aquinas, the common doctor of the Church, whose teaching is especially revered in morals. One has only to read the famous encyclical Aeterni Patris, 1879, of the great Pope Leo XIII, to see how highly regarded by the Church is St Thomas's teaching on natural morality, drawing on Aristotle's genial work. Any discussion of our present subject would have to be built upon the foundations laid by Aristotle and Aquinas. I myself have written an exposition of this very aspect of their work in a book, Ethics Today and St Thomas Aquinas. What I have to say in this short talk must presuppose the treatment of happiness as the natural end to be found there. It is evident that human nature, as every natural creature, is to be explained in terms of its causes, which Aristotle shows are principally four: two intrinsic, form and matter, as formal and material causes, and two extrinsic, agent and end, as efficient and final causes. A fifth, exemplary cause, comes in as the extrinsic formal cause. Natural happiness is the ultimate end desired, and Aristotle shows that it has to consist in the object of the highest activity of human beings, which is not bodily, but proper to us as of spiritual soul. That brings in the spiritual power of intellect from which our free will flows. These two are involved since the end has to be a good, and the ultimate end, the highest good desired. Aristotle puts the object of happiness as the good had in the activity of contemplation. This makes it seem as if it is a purely intellectual activity, like vision. But being conceived under the aspect of good, it has to be also a satisfaction of desire or appetite, which pertains to the will. We will not go into how the two spiritual powers of intellect and will are related in the idea of happiness. We will just note that in possessing the good seen, the role of the will as appetite or desire is as its end and its place taken by joy, which necessarily accompanies the vision of the ultimate good. Since both the true and good are involved, the transcendental beautiful may bring out the vision and joy involved. That which seen pleases. As we shall see, Aristotle's treatment does leave a couple of problems to be resolved, but he does make it clear that only the good can be happy. This means that happiness as the ultimate end or good possessed is attained only by those humans of virtue, which means especially moral virtue. It is only the good who can be happy. There are a couple of things about Aristotle's treatment that we should mention here. One is how God is to be considered the ultimate end, even as our natural happiness. Aristotle places it in the highest act of contemplation or wisdom. He evidently relates this knowledge to the contemplation of the divine. But we know that what God is beyond the natural capacity of the human intellect, indeed of any created intellect. It seems then that God cannot be the object of happiness, either as known or desired. The problem is partially solved by certain things that Aristotle says, such as that the most joyful contemplation is upon the highest spiritual things, because they are most like God. It is only because they are like God that they are loved most. Accordingly, God is more lovable and loved than them, even though we do not know God directly. This may be clearer if we appreciate that God is the Alpha and the Omega of all creation. It is not knowers only that can be said to desire God above all things. St. Thomas points out that desire has to be given the widest meaning, so that even inanimate things coming into being from God naturally have God as their ultimate end. They tend back to their origin as befits their condition. Happiness is but the name given to the ultimate end of things of spiritual form. St Thomas, who insists that human intellect cannot know the essence of God, which is to say, by univocal knowledge, nonetheless allows a knowledge of what God is by an analogous knowledge. This has its own difficulties, but it can allow us to say that the ultimate good naturally loved by us is God. Although we know more about what God is not than what God is, nevertheless, since every cause produces its like, we can have some positive knowledge of God as the first cause. However, only some causes have sufficient power to produce something of the same nature as themselves. We see this in living reproduction, as in parents and their children. St. Thomas calls them univocal causes. But if the cause exceeds the nature of its effect, which God does infinitely, the effect cannot be equal to the cause. St. Thomas sometimes calls such a cause an equivocal cause, but Aristotle did not clearly distinguish in the beginning the equivocal from the analogous. It is made clear in St. Thomas's treatment of the divine names in the Summa Theologiae that the term equivocal used in this regard should be taken as analogous. Something popped up on the screen. Although the effect is not the same nature as the cause, it is similar, from which we can gain some idea of the nature of the cause. In the case of God, of course, it falls short, indeed infinitely so, in apprehending, let alone comprehending, the fullness of divine being. Mind you, we are talking here of our natural knowledge, not of revealed knowledge. Where it is wittily said that God is a God of surprises, how analogy is applied to our knowledge of God, even from natural reason, we deal with in another work. There is an apparent problem that we have averted to already, in that Aristotle says that we cannot attain perfect happiness in this life, because both virtue and it may be lost, especially by change in our will. For instance, a long-time sober man becomes a drunkard for whatever reason. So even a person who is law-abiding and virtuous, and therefore naturally happy, can become miserable by his own fault. The impermanence of this happiness is what Aristotle would refer to as imperfect happiness. However, this does not really present a problem in understanding the nature of happiness, nor in its connection with the love of God. Happiness, even though temporary, is the perfect state of human life consequent on being and doing good. The problem of permanence depends upon what would be the fate, from a natural point of view, of the good person dying in such a state of being happy. We just have to be careful here not to let the actual or factual condition of original sin and redemptive grace complicate the analysis. The difference is that though no one can say he is without sin, if venial only, the saint who dies a martyr knows that his graced happiness is assured. Happy are those who fear the Lord and walk in his ways, Psalm 128. But there is a problem that is somewhat hidden in Aristotle's treatment. This is to do with how Aristotle tends to end his book on general ethics. By ordering it to political ethics and even treating the common good of the civil community as a supreme good. We will deal with this in the next chapter. Though St. Thomas does not appear to correct Aristotle in his commentary on the Nicomachean ethics, he does in another place where he points out that the human person is not subject to the political order or its common good in all that he is. That is to say, there is a higher ethical order to which the human person owes allegiance and which the political ruler must respect. That, naturally enough, is the order of personal ethics, whose common good is God. Indeed, in his Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle has been occupied almost exclusively with this order. It may be noted that Aristotle himself, elsewhere in his works, makes the same point as St. Thomas with regard to the subordination of political ethics and common good to the higher ethical order of the person. We just need to note that personal ethics is not individualistic. It refers to the human person as he or she belongs to a community, the widest community, as a creature of spiritual form, whose happiness consists in common with all other creatures of spiritual form in the possession, as explained, of the divine good that is God himself, supernaturally themselves. To see it in terms of common good is important, not only from the point of view of love of God, but also from the point of view of love of neighbor. We need to appreciate that there are three ethical orders: the personal, domestic, and civil. The latter two may appear superficially, from a human point of view, to have some priority, but they are secondary and fully subordinate to the first. We need to keep this in mind in all questions with regard to ethics. And it is no coincidence that with the modern reversion to paganism in moral matters, it is the political order that tends to be used to dominate the rule of all human affairs, including personal and religious. However, let us move on to the second part of our talk. Chapter 2. It has been held in theology that happiness must be said to consist in the possession of God alone. This is a clear position of St Thomas Aquinas, and most theologians have held to the same position. However, in recent times, some, such as Germain Grisey, have seemed to challenge even St Thomas in this regard. Discussion around this can be found in detail in an article by Ezra Sullivan, OP, in 2010, entitled "Seeking First the Kingdom, a reply to Germain Grisey's account of man's ultimate end." We have already prepared for publication a book of critique of Germain Grisey's article on the first practical principle and the theory of natural law, of the School of New Natural Law, to which he is connected with the Australian John Finnis. There is much discussion in recent times critical of this theory, which also challenges the position of Aquinas, who we defend. I would recommend a number of authors in this respect, but will name only Diego Poole. That is not to say I would agree with everything they say. However, we are concerned here only with the issue of whether our happiness consists in God alone. Being a Catholic theologian of long standing and well respected in the USA, Grisey's arguments do have a degree of a very similitude and seem to be seriously addressed and need to be seriously addressed. Not all modern Catholic moral theologians are equipped to do this. This is due mainly to the general neglect in Catholic education in the West, inverted commas, led by experts, in inverted commas, in the United States, of the study of works of St Thomas Aquinas. This is despite repeated urgings of the magisterium. Indeed, since the Protestant Reformation, the spirit of deliberate dissent of the divine authority of the Church seems to have filtered into the minds of educated, inverted commas, Catholics, so that many hold independence from certainty and truth as a proof of their independence of mind and their daring as intellectual courage. There is lacking then an understanding of elementary principles and fundamental distinctions required to deal properly with issues such as the one we are now concerned with. We will mention the more important here. One has already been adverted to. That is, that there are three orders of ethics which come from the three kinds of communities to which human beings belong. We refer to them as personal ethics, domestic ethics, and political ethics. Each has its corresponding common good. Not only are the relationships between these poorly understood, but also the very notion of common good is hardly understood even by Catholic moralists. Diego Poole has some understanding of it, but might seem like a voice crying in the wilderness. Without a clear understanding of the three common goods, with God pertaining to personal ethics, discussion of the issue concerned here can only go awry. There is a fundamental distinction needed in reference to the meaning of happiness. In modern terms, it is called that between happiness objectively taken and subjectively taken. What it means in relation to our discussion here is the difference between God as what is desired as the ultimate end or good, and the mode of possession by which we attain to that end or good. In modern philosophical parlance, The words objective and subjective have become so misused that it is best to avoid them in any context of knowledge or desire. Sullivan uses the term primary and secondary to make the distinction, but they too can be misleading. They are rather like two sides of the union of thing action, as when I grasp a ball and distinguish between the ball and my grasp. Is the grasp some other thing? Do I become the ball? Then when we move to the act of knowledge, things are a bit more complicated. Knowledge is a kind of becoming knowledge is a kind of becoming what we know, but not to be taken in the ordinary physical, metaphysical sense of become. A better understanding of the psychology of Aristotle and Aquinas, so sadly lacking, is required. This fundamental distinction becomes important when we are dealing with happiness. For there is evident difference in the grasp when dealing with natural happiness than when dealing with supernatural happiness. Being a theologian, we may presume that Grisey was dealing with the beatific vision. But in this argumentation, he is more likely to be thinking of natural happiness. Shortly, the goods of wealth, health, natural wisdom, and even friends are to the forefront of our minds when dealing of happiness in natural terms, whilst love of God is somewhat in the background and even hidden for the reasons we have explained. St. Paul noted that the pagan Greeks had an altar to the unknown God. It is difficult outside of the beatific vision to contemplate being happy without family and friends, despite knowing intellectually in wisdom that God alone is good. Aristotle felt compelled to admit some friends, a few, into the notion of natural happiness, and as we shall see, St. Thomas has to deal with the question of where such goods can be fitted into supernatural happiness. So we need to proceed to deal with the issue as a serious one. In order to do this, we first should bring in a third distinction. The failure to take into account will inhibit our understanding of the solution. It is to do with the most fundamental metaphysical question of being. Here, unfortunately, there is widespread confusion even among even those claiming to be Thomists. Many modern theologians who wish to resurrect metaphysics are, wittingly or unwittingly, still infected to one degree or another with disputations of late scholasticism, particularly as indulged in by Scotus and Occam, which was continued by Suarez S.J., and partially passed on to modern philosophy through Descartes. We only allude to this here, as we have dealt with this historical matter elsewhere. Such a fundamental messing with metaphysics has naturally had an unfortunate effect on modern philosophers and theologians, including Catholic. The same applies to the problem we are concerned with. So we will spend a little time explaining how this is so. The concept of being is composite, made up of two parts or principles: essence as potency, what can be, and existence or esse as act, is or be. It is an analogous concept and is tied closely to is, which is the soul of judgment. It signifies what is. It is the same as thing, but St. Thomas points out that being refers primarily to be, esse, whilst thing, res, refers primarily to essence. We need to be very careful because in talking about things, we tend to focus on the essence. The word think comes from be thinged. In ordinary human language, to think means we become in some way the thing. The Latin reor, for I think, means literally I am the thing. Our knowledge comes first from the real world. What demolishes modern philosophy of knowledge comes from John Locke. What I know first are my internal ideas, and David Hume, and ending in Kant and Hegel. However, we still need to be careful because our use of think and thing, as noted, focuses our mind on essences, especially misleading in metaphysics. We begin to lose contact with existence. The late scholastics prepared the ground here for the twin modern errors of idealism and positivism. The other danger is that we lose the distinction between univocal and analogous knowledge. This began to happen after St Thomas, with later scholastics, attempted to discuss the meaning of being. Scotus even taught that the word or concept of being was univocal. That caused havoc with the discussion of our knowledge of God. What complicated things was that Scotus was rather loose in his use of words, such as univocal, equivocal, and analogous. Some of his explanations of such language would even allow his meaning of univocity to accommodate analogy. This subtle doctor was rather too subtle in regard to the most fundamental philosophical issues. Thus, the interpretation of his philosophy is not easy. It is good in parts, but as with his formal distinction a parte re, he mixes up logically constructed concepts with those which simply reflect real things. Though he subsequently says things that can be interpreted as analogous, he posited the concept of being as univocal in a way that is not compatible with St Thomas. What he seems to pose is a logical type concept of being that is quasi-superior, like a genus, to finite being, creatures, and infinite being, God. This creates logically a concept that is prior to God and mixes up logic and metaphysics, natural theology, in speaking about God. Metaphysics gets lost in logical disputation. We will see how this is shortly. Suarez took on Scotus's misconception or misunderstanding of the meaning of being, and this fundamental error has carried over not only into modern non-Catholic philosophy, but also into modern Catholic theology, adversely affecting both natural and sacred theology. Unfortunately, interest in the subtlety of Scotus's philosophy has returned in recent Catholic academic studies. St Thomas is studied in this context, with some anxious to push Scotus's philosophy. However, we do not wish to enter into this nest of confusion. Here we merely want to clarify the concept of being ends and show, as St Thomas does, that God is to be grasped ever so slightly in philosophical terms as esse only, pure act, understanding that he thereby transcends absolutely the concept of created being, act limited by potency, the composite concept of essentia and esse. We have trouble here because act naturally signifies action and supposes power, both as properties of a substance or thing. So St Thomas says, we cannot say God is a thing, nor act, but have to get some idea of him across. So too, our feeble grasp of God transcends the order of concepts as we use them univocally. It is analogous, which means beyond the order of logic as generally understood. Aristotle insists it is not a genus. This is where most mix up logic and metaphysics. What is significant in having the right notions of created being and uncreated God is that God already contains all being existing, esse without limit. Creation does not add anything of being considered absolutely. Upon creation, there is nothing more of being, but just more beings sharing existence by God's free willing to have limited imitations of himself. Conclusion. This is how we can show that Griset's position is mistaken, in that God alone is the complete happiness of spiritual creatures, yet nothing prevents God's infinite generosity from overflowing to allow the good that is in created goods, already in God, from also being enjoyed in what he has created. This is not so clear to see with natural happiness, but is crystal clear with supernatural happiness. There is no need then to go further with the discussion of this consequent issue regarding true happiness. So too, we may end our talk on true happiness.